Before I start, I should mention that much of this talk is written up if people want to get a written version. It's in the December CACM, which many of you can download. But also, if you go to my publications page at Stanford, which is easy, just Google or Bing or whatever, Hellman Stanford, you'll get my homepage, and then look for publications, go there. And one of the last of the journal publications is that CACM article. Some of these stories are also written up in a book that my wife and I wrote, which is mostly about other things, but if you you can get a free PDF, which is also under books on that same publications page, and search on NSA, RSA, cryptography, and you'll find the relevant sections. So I'm talking about crypto wars, which says there's more than one, and I see three of them. The first was roughly 1975 to 1980, and the second was roughly 1990 to 1995, and then we're in the middle of one now that started a few years ago. So first, second, and third crypto wars. Very briefly, the first crypto war was about DES key size, the data encryption standard, which was the standard for commercial encryption for many years, from roughly 75 when it was proposed through 2000 or 2001 when the advanced encryption standard came in, had a 56-bit key size, and I'll cover that in a little more detail later, but 56 bits has only 2 to the 56 keys, only. That's only 100,000 million, and as we'll see in a few minutes, that's not as big as it sounds. The other part of the first crypto war was the question of whether I should be thrown in jail for publishing my papers, and that's only a minor exaggeration, as you'll see. And we won the first part of the, we lost the first part of the crypto war, that is DES key size stayed at 56 bits for, 25 years. We did win the second part of that war, which is the freedom to publish our papers. The second crypto war in the mid to late 90s was centered around export controls, Clipper chip, which some of you may remember, and I'll describe in a little more detail, Key Escrow, which is the idea that someone should hold a master key so that if a court order was issued, that the FBI could listen in on your conversation with a court order. The third crypto war is in many ways a repeat of the second, and I'll describe that in more detail later. And exceptional accesses are the key words that go with that, which are very similar to Key Escrow from the second crypto war. And the FBI Apple court case in early 2016 involving the San Bernardino terrorist incident and trying to break into their iPhone will figure prominently there. So let's talk about the first crypto war in some more detail. That was kind of an overview. When DES was announced in 1975, March 1975, Whit Diffie and I looked at it, and we very quickly realized that 56 bits was at best a marginal key size. Now, as I told you, that means there are roughly 100,000 million keys. How could that be marginal? Well, even with 1975 technology, we estimated you could build a chip to search 1 million keys per second. If you're going to build a custom chip like that, you don't just want to buy one of them because the design cost is what dominates. So you buy 1 million of those chips at roughly $10 a piece. That's $10 million, a significant amount of money, but not out of the range. And you're now searching 1 million keys per second because you have 1 million chips, each searching 1 million keys per second. So how long does it take to search 100,000 million keys? 100,000 seconds, which is a little more than a day. A day's a little over 80,000 seconds. And we estimated the cost by amortizing the machine, figuring an additional cost, was about $10,000 per solution. And the National Bureau of Standards, now NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which had promulgated this standard, said we were off. Now, we recognized we could be off by as much as maybe an order of magnitude, a factor of 10, but that would be erased in 5 years' time by Moore's Law, which was still very strong in the mid-70s. But they said we were off by a factor of 10,000, and they were wrong. But even if they were, a factor of 10,000 would be erased in 20 years. and DES lasted more than 20 years. The question arose, at first Whit and I thought that we had a technical problem on our hands, and we tried arguing that they should increase the key size. It was cheap to increase the key size. But after about 6 months of writing letters to the Bureau of Standards, and incidentally, the two people we were writing letters to at the Bureau of Standards had both transferred over from the National Security Agency. And so we began to get the feeling that we were really dealing with NSA more than with NBS, and I still believe that's the case. We realized after about 6 months that we had a political problem, not a technical problem, and we were advised and we realized that if we were going to do anything about the key size, we had to try to get congressional hearings, we had to try to get media coverage. We couldn't fight it as a purely technical problem. As we geared up to do that in January 1976, so 9 months after the standard was announced, two high-level NSA employees flew out to California to meet with us, and they were very nice. They were trying to convince us to be quiet, but they were also very insistent. And they basically said, you're wrong, but please be quiet. If you keep talking this way, you're going to cause grave harm to national security. Now, of course, that doesn't make any sense. How could we be wrong and we're going to cause grave harm to national security? What they were really saying is, you're right, but please be quiet. If you keep talking this way, you're going to cause grave harm to national security. So I went home that night to figure out the right thing to do. My intellect was telling me the right thing was to go public. Remember, this is 1976, soon after Watergate, so appeals to national security, and if you knew what we knew, you'd think differently, didn't hold very much water, certainly much less than they did on September 12, 2001, right after the terrorist attacks. And as I'm trying to figure out so my intellect told me the right thing to do is go public, NSA is telling me the right thing to do is be quiet. As I'm trying to figure out the right thing to do, an idea pops into my head, unasked for. And it basically said, forget about what's right and wrong. You'll never have more of a chance to impact the world. You'll never have more of a chance to be famous or infamous. Run with it. Now, you don't want to go public on those grounds, right? So I liken it to a movie where, you know, the angel's on one shoulder of the actor and the devil's on the other, and they're both whispering in his ear trying to get him to do one thing or the other. And this was the devil. That idea that popped into my head was like the devil sitting on my shoulder telling me to do it whether it was right or wrong. Now, at the time, I thought that I was able to brush the devil off my shoulder and make the decision to go public as the right thing to do. But 5 years later, and I don't have time to go into it, as I was watching a documentary about the making of the first atom bomb, I realized that I'd fooled myself, just as I believe the people working on the bomb fooled themselves. And this is described, I think, only in the book, not in the CACM paper. And so five years later, in 1981, when I had that realization watching that documentary, I vowed I would never make that mistake again. By the way, I did make the right decision, but I made it for the wrong reasons. And how do I know I made the right decision? How do I know I'm not fooling myself now? Well, a little over 3 years ago, one of Dan Bonez's students, Henry Corrigan Gibbs, wrote a nice article for the Stanford Alumni magazine, and in it, he interviewed Admiral Bobby Inman, who was director of NSA at the time, loosely speaking, the guy who thought I should go to jail if I kept publishing my papers. And here's what that article said. In an unexpected turn today, Inman is as worried about protecting non-governmental computer systems as Hellman was in the 1970s. When asked if he would make the same decisions about non-governmental cryptography now as he did then, Inman replied, quote, rather than being careful to make sure they weren't going to damage our collection capabilities, I would have been interested in how quickly they were going to be able to make their Cryptosystem available in a form that would protect proprietary information as well as government information. End of quote. Inman then went on to cite the theft of portions of design for the F-35 jet as evidence that weak non-governmental encryption is a problem for national security. So I know I made the right decision because my opponent is now agreeing with me. In May of that year, May 1976, another event happened that added to NSA's concern. This was the invention of the first practical public key crypto system. Because up to that point, if you wanted to exchange keys, if, let's say, Mendel and I wanted to exchange a key, I'd have to send a courier over to him. I couldn't just call it out across the room because Ed would hear it, and Ed Feigenbaum sitting there, dastardly person that he is, and he would. So, but the goal is for Mendel and I talking back and forth to exchange keys without any prearrangement. And I'm going to give you a rough idea of how that worked. And this is very similar to what's now called Diffie-Hellman Key Exchange. I write out the message, and the message could be even use the following key, and I put it in a strong box. So we're going to make it into a physical system, and then we have to mathematize it. Unfortunately, I have to hand it to Ed because he's between me and Mendel. But he can't open it because he doesn't know the combination. And Ed hands it to all the people at that table, and eventually Mendel gets it. And Mendel can't open it because he doesn't know the combination either. But I've made the hasp of the lock big enough for Mendel to put a second lock on. So he puts on a lock to which only he knows the combination. It's now doubly locked. He passes it back through all these dishonest people to me. They can't open it. When I get it, what do? I take my lock off, leaving only Mendel's lock. I pass it back through Ed and all the other people. They still can't open it. When Mendel gets it, he can open it. Now, imagine that instead I had made the hasp only big enough for one lock. Well then, when Mendel got my strong box, he might have tried putting it in a bigger strong box and locking that. But then when I got it back, I couldn't get inside to take my lock off. It's not commutative. It matters which order you put the locks on and which order you take the locks off. And so what was important in this function that I found in May of 1976, the discrete logarithm or discrete exponential function, was that it was a commutative one-way function. So I'll stop there. There are also digital signatures, but there's not enough time to get into that. So this increased NSA's concerns because I think they may have thought before with DES with a 56-bit key size, we saw it as marginal. They saw it as way too strong because before that, most information was unencrypted. So the cost of eavesdropping was almost nothing, whereas $10,000 per key is a lot. But prior to public key cryptography, people might change keys once a year or never. Whereas now they could change them daily, every hour, every minute, and that made that $10,000 per solution a much more daunting barrier. And so Witt and I, and Ralph Merkle was also involved, he's described in the CACM paper. I won't have time to go into his contributions now, but he deserves a lot of credit, I would say equal credit, for the privacy part of public key cryptography. We knew NSA was unhappy, but all of the fighting was going on in the press, and it was never NSA, it was always proxies. Finally, in July 1977, the IEEE, the Maine Electrical Engineering Professional Society, gets a letter from one of its members living in Maryland, from his home address. And he says, as an IEEE member, I'm concerned that the organization appears to be breaking the law by publishing certain papers that are covered by the International Traffic in Arms Regulations, or ITAR. And he's very kindly sent a copy of the ITAR to the IEEE. And he cited about 6 journal issues, not the papers themselves, but journal issues that he felt had offending papers. Witt and I had papers in 5 of the 6 journal issues. I don't know what the 6th one was that he was referring to. So this is another interesting thing that goes on. When people start talking about cryptography, even when they don't have to, they start talking in code. And what he was basically saying is IEEE quit publishing Hellman's papers, but he said it in code. IEEE wrote back in code. They said, well, this isn't code. We're well aware of the ITAR, but it's always been our position that we cannot be the gatekeepers. It's up to the authors, their institutions, to make sure they're not in violation of this law. And what the code was, they sent it to me. Now, if they sent it to me as author of most of these papers, it wouldn't be in code. But they sent it to me as a member of the governing board of the information theory group of the IEEE, which was publishing most of these papers. They didn't send it to all the governors. And so that's the code. I took the letter to John Schwartz, who was Stanford's general counsel at the time over in the inner quad. And I did it for two reasons. First of all, Stanford was potentially liable. Secondly, if I was prosecuted, I wanted to make sure that I had Stanford's financial backing, because defending yourself in a major court case can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, and it would have bankrupted me. So I went to John, and he looked it over for a few days. We had a second meeting set up, and there's actually a memo he wrote to me, which is in the Stanford Library archives. I scanned it and gave them permission to post it. And in it, he said, "It's my legal opinion that if the ITAR are construed broadly enough to cover publication of your papers, they are unconstitutional, because we have freedom of speech, freedom of the press." But he then went on to say there is clearly at least one contrary legal opinion, that of the man who'd written the letter to the IEEE. And Witt had determined that he worked at NSA, although at the time it seemed like this was NSA's way of shooting a shot across our bow. And while people within the agency were very upset with us, we now know that for a fact. We knew it, we believed it then. We now believe the man who wrote this letter, J.A. Meyer, was acting on his own initiative in this particular case. And so John said, so the only way to settle this is in a court of law. If you're prosecuted, we will defend you. If you're convicted, we will appeal. But he said, I've got to be careful to warn you, we obviously can't go to jail for you if all appeals are exhausted. But I felt comfortable with Stanford's backing. I felt this was pretty clear-cut. And John made one other suggestion. This was July 77. That October, 3 months later, I had two papers with students, Steve Polig and Ralph Merkel. Witt and I had already published our key paper earlier. And we had papers at the International Symposium on Information Theory at Cornell University in Ithaca. And John said, I strongly recommend that you give the papers instead of the students, even though we had planned for the students to give the papers. So I told the students about this, and I said, whatever you want to do is fine with me. I feel comfortable with Stanford's financial backing. It's not clear they could defend you. Plus, John pointed out a new PhD, if he had a multi-year court case hanging over his head, might have trouble finding a job, whereas I was a tenured professor. The students courageously said that they would give the papers anyway, but about a week later they come back to me one at a time, and they said, our mothers are really disturbed and beating on us over the phone. You go ahead and give the papers to make them happy. So when it was time for the papers, each one in turn, I had the student come with me to the podium, and I told the audience, I said, from all points of view except legally, I want you to consider the words I'm saying as if they're coming from the student. I want him to get the credit he deserves. And of course, they got much more credit this way than they ever would have without any legal threat hanging over us. We were not arrested, although later Phil Zimmerman of PGP was not arrested, but he did need legal representation over something very similar. So how did the first crypto war end? It ended, the beginning of the end was 1978. I get a call from the director's office at NSA. The director, Admiral Bobby Inman, will be in California in a few weeks, and if you're open, he'd like to meet with you. And I jumped at the opportunity, and so a few weeks later, he comes to my office. It was Durand 135, for those of you who know campus. And when he came to my office, his first words were, he looked over at me, and he said, it's nice to see that you don't have horns, which is how I was being depicted in NSA. And I looked right back at him very carefully, and I said, nice to see the same here, because I had been demonizing NSA. And this is one of the problems we get into not just in fights like this, but with coworkers, wives, husbands, internationally. We demonize the other side. And the other thing he told me is, he told me many things, but the two that I want to mention here, I'm meeting with you, he's told me, against the advice of all the other senior personnel at the agency. Because again, who would go talk to the devil? But then he said, but I don't see the harm in talking. And that is really key. I mean, he was open, he was curious, and out of that initial cautious encounter, we developed a relationship that now is a friendship. I had lunch with him a few years ago when my daughter was working in Austin, and he's at University of Texas, Austin. We had lunch together, and there have been many other interactions that we've had. Another thing that came out of that meeting is Inman decided to go to Congress and seek legislation that would make it clear that research in cryptography was born classified, even if the researchers had no previous exposure. I remember having dinner with him, in fact, at my home here on campus, and saying, well, you know, that might work in the military, because he has a military approach to things, because you're thinking that the editor will act as the gatekeeper, but you're going to really piss off the researchers, and it's just going to convince them that you are the devil incarnate. And they will test the law. The law may be found unconstitutional. It's a question of if you'll even get a law. But even if the law is, even in the best of circumstances for this law, if it's found constitutional, they'll give 100 talks before they publish, and you can't stop that. And so to his credit, he changed his approach, and he tried a voluntary system using the American Council on Education to voluntarily, researchers could voluntarily submit their papers. Some of us did, some did not. And from that cautious beginning, it led to understanding and respect and eventually friendship, although we don't always agree. But the quote that I gave from Inman saying that now he would try to get our work out more quickly indicates that both sides have changed their perspective. Now, things quieted down, but still there was a major problem. Export of commercial encryption hardware and software was limited to pretty much 40-bit keys. Now, if a 56-bit key can be searched for $10,000 in 1975, imagine what a 40-bit key, 65,000 times smaller, 65,000 times easier to search, what that would cost, especially with the passage of time at a factor of 10 every 5 years. And another thing that came up, so this wasn't a major problem until the advent of the internet. And then things like Lotus Notes, Ray Ozzie had this problem, and he wanted to encrypt. And so the advent of the internet created a huge market for encryption software. And around the same time, the government proposed Key Escrow. And the idea behind, and this became the second crypto war of the mid to late, of the 1990s roughly. And the Key Escrow, the idea was that we'd have an escrow agent, Ed Feigenbaum. We all trust him. And every conversation over a phone, every conversation between computers, it could be encrypted using a session key, but the session key would be encrypted under a master key unique to that device, and Ed would hold all the master keys. So if the FBI got a court order to listen in on a conversation, they could go to the Key Escrow agent, get the master key, and from that get the session key. And the NSA actually developed something called the Clipper chip that some of you may remember. The Clipper chip was a chip that you couldn't reverse engineer. It had, layers and stuff, and it had actually a classified 80-bit NSA certified algorithm. Now, of course, that's both good and bad. I mean, even if you trust how do you trust the algorithm? You don't know it's there. Plus, even if you do trust it, then you've got the problem that we have to trust the escrow agent and make sure that he's not compromised. Oh, and it used Diffie-Hellman Key Exchange, that's very similar to the strong boxes that I just described. Now, in those days, both law enforcement and national security interests wanted Key Escrow, which is interesting. Unlike today, in the third crypto war, as you'll see in a few minutes, the national security community, it does not want exceptional access, and I'll give some quotes. November 1993, Congress requested the National Research Council, the research arm of the National Academies, undertake a study to look at these issues of key escrow, export, and I was on the committee that looked into this, and I did take a security clearance, an intelligence clearance, in fact, to be on the committee, which I'd always studiously avoided before. We had people representing all interests. Law enforcement was represented by a former Attorney General, Benjamin Civiletti. NSA was represented by Ann Cara Christie, a former deputy director of NSA. The industry was represented by Ray Ozzie, among others, who later succeeded Bill Gates as Microsoft's chief software architect. I represented privacy interests, as did some other people. But in spite of that very broad composition of the committee, we reached consensus. Now, to do that, we had to compromise, but we looked at what was possible, and we came up with some major findings, all of which were implemented within a year or two. Now, we can't say for sure that our report's why it happened, but I think we played at least some role. The first thing we said was that key escrow was not well defined, and many problems had been overlooked in the simple statement. For example, what do you do with international communications where the United States trusts one key escrow agent and France trusts another one, or Russia trusts another one? That's just one example. And the third crypto war that's ongoing now has that same problem. We suggested, therefore, that the government experiment with key escrow for its own purposes, and if it could ever solve these problems that we saw, to come back to us with a solution, which they never did. And that same problem, I believe, still applies to exceptional access in the third crypto war that's going on now, which in many ways is a repeat of the second crypto war. Another thing that was pointed out is that while it was often said that law enforcement and national security wanted weak encryption, several people on the committee, including the chairman who had worked in the Department of Justice in the Reagan administration, if I remember, Ken Dam, that the best law enforcement is crime prevention. It's much cheaper to prevent crime than it is to prosecute a crime once it's happened, and strong encryption would prevent many crimes. And so law enforcement and national security interests were not solely on the side of weak encryption. We recommended relatively free export of DES, which was a huge jump for the time, and that happened about a year later. And now, of course, the advanced encryption standard, which has an even larger key size, a minimum of 128 bits, is relatively freely exportable. We also, another important finding was that the classified briefings that we had really didn't affect our findings. And yet, in the unclassified briefings, people still said, if you knew what we knew, you'd think differently. And so I didn't put much faith in it then, but I put even less in it now. So that was the second crypto war and how it kind of ended. And I know I'm at 28 minutes, and I'll probably go 35. Things quieted down again, and AES was developed in the second half of the 90s, and it was done as Witt and I had said DES should have been done. It was done in a transparent, open manner. Instead of DES was given to us in the Federal Register with no previous warning. Whereas AES, there were meetings, there were multiple submissions, and the unclassified research community attacked these various systems, and there was general agreement that the advanced encryption standard, RINDAL, as it was known before, from two Belgians, by the way, it was probably the best of the algorithms. But the third crypto war heated up more recently when, in December 2015, the terrorist attack in San Bernardino killed a number of people. And while the attackers, the terrorists, were killed themselves, there was an iPhone 5C that belonged to them that was locked. And so the FBI tried to get a court order to force Apple to unlock it. And there are many problems with this that I don't have time to go into. In March, though, just a month after the court case started, the FBI asked for a delay, and then they actually withdrew their request because they got a third party to break into the phone without Apple's helping them. But I think they were really trying to set a precedent, and I think they got worried that the precedent might go against them. But the legislative possibility still lives on. I was checking with Dan Bonek because I'm not as current now as I used to be. The Burr-Feinstein bill is probably dead, which would have mandated things like this. But now we have a new administration, much more friendly to law enforcement's interests. So we do have to watch out. So as I said, I'm not current, but I've spoken to people who are, including Dan Boner, Ron Rivest, and maybe the best way to put it is there's a report signed by a number of very expert cryptographers called Keys Under Doormats. And look it up, you can find it on the web, it's a PDF. And they basically are arguing that exceptional access is like hiding a key under the doormat. It creates lots of weaknesses, and it's not, the government makes a nice case on the surface, but underneath it all, there are lots of problems that are being overlooked. One big difference between the crypto war, third and second crypto wars, is that national security is now on the side of privacy. It's only law enforcement that's asking for exceptional access. Inman's quote from a few years ago that I gave you is one example. And then here's an article from January 2016 in The Intercept. National Security Agency Director Admiral Mike Rogers said Thursday that, quote, encryption is foundational to the future, end quote, and arguing about it is a waste of time. Rogers stressed that the cybersecurity battles the U.S. is destined to fight call for more widespread use of encryption, not less. Quote, what you saw at OPM, the Office of Personnel Management, when all those records were hacked, you're going to see a whole lot more, he said, referring to the massive hack of the Office of Personnel Management, involving the personal data of about 20 million people who have gotten background checks, including me. So, quote, so spending time arguing about, hey, encryption's bad and we ought to do away with it, that's a waste of time to me, Rogers said, shaking his head. Other government officials, this is still from the article, most noticeably FBI Director James Comey, now former Director James Comey, have been crusading for a way that law enforcement can get access to encrypted data. The previous NSA Director, Michael Hayden, said in January that he thinks Comey is on the wrong side of this debate. This is a quote from Hayden. I disagree with Jim Comey. I actually think end-to-end encryption is good for America, he said. So important difference that now the national security interests are arguing for strong encryption, and it's only law enforcement that wants to weaken it. These stories illustrate several more general points that relate to actually the book my wife and I wrote, which is about successful relationships at home and in the world. In particular, we argue that we should get curious, not furious. Like that's the way we stop fighting in our marriage. Ask more questions rather than getting mad at the other person. And Inman's saying to me in our very first meeting, I don't see the harm in talking. He was curious, not furious. He was not demonizing me. Another lesson is it's better to have friends than enemies. As one example, Inman, when I was working on a risk analysis of nuclear deterrence about 10 years ago, I wanted people with more expertise in national security to sign a statement of support. So I approached Admiral Inman, and he agreed to sign it. Now, he clearly wouldn't sign it if he didn't agree with it, but he also wouldn't have signed it if he didn't trust me, and so our friendship was key to that. Now, while it's obvious that it's better to have friends than enemies, how many people take the effort, as Inman did, to try to turn an enemy into a friend? Very few of us do, and that's something we need to do much more often. I hope that these approaches that produce friends instead of enemies, getting curious instead of furious, will be used to resolve this third crypto war, and hopefully will therefore do it in a more reasonable fashion than otherwise. Thank you very much. Do we have time for some questions?
And do we have microphones? Yes, right here, please. It's coming, Carl. There you go.
Oh, thank you. So thank you for your wonderful work for the Turing Award and for the great article that he has in the CACM and for your speech.
I paid him.
That's right. I'll collect later. So everybody agrees that encryption is a good thing, and they want key escrow. And Dianne Feinstein last November announced that she's bringing back the Burr-Feinstein Act with the applause of the FBI. And China, it looks like, has decided to adopt national key escrow. And they think that they have a scheme that is proof even against the NSA, even though they wouldn't dare do it. And their plan is that if you go to China with your phone, they will go to your national escrow office and say, okay, you want to do a deal? Then we'll let Marty in and use his phone. Otherwise, he'll buy a burner phone here. So they think they can get away with it. And if they get away with it, Russia can get away with it, Turkey can get away with it, Hungary can get away with it, Poland can get away with it. And it's the law in the UK, France, Germany, and Australia. What are our chances against key escrow?
It'd be better to ask Dan or some of the other people who actually, or you, people who actually know what's going on. What I would say is, while they can make it the law, they can't repeal the laws of physics, the laws of mathematics, and they're creating potential holes in the system. And so
They think it's good enough the NSA can't break it.
they think that.
That's right. Otherwise, they wouldn't do it.
Intel thought that their microprocessors were good enough until several people, including my good friend Paul Kocher, found this, these flaws.
And also, like Intel, they have to have a scheme so that if a flaw is discovered, they can fix it, and they think they've got that
Actually,
too.
Intel cannot fix the Spectre flaw.
They are doing repairs against the Spectre flaw, and when they ship the next generation of chips in 2 years, there will be no Spectre flaw.
Will they still do look ahead?
Yes, they will.
Okay, again, I'd have to defer
The
to...
devil is in the details.
Okay. Ed
Going back to
Feigenbaum.
the second crypto war, excuse me, I was in Washington for 3 years during that period, so I had a good look at what was going on. To what extent do you think that the second crypto war was over because at the Defense Department you had Bill Perry, a wonderfully rational mathematician manager, and in the White House you had a Rhodes Scholar, really smart people?
I think that certainly helped. The other thing that went on is NSA, I know this for a fact, NSA found that the papers we published that told people how to do good encryption didn't dry up their communications intelligence. People still did stupid things. And so one reason that I think that today you have law enforcement wanting exceptional access and national security, in particular NSA, not being that concerned with it, I think NSA has much better technical expertise and is able to get at stuff in ways that the FBI can't. And I would, certainly 20 years ago, when I was on that NRC committee, the FBI's capabilities were minuscule compared to NSA's. And so that may be part of it too.
More questions?
People want a bathroom break. Oh, there's a question.
Well, what about quantum entanglement? So that there was experiments done to satellite communication using quantum entanglement to prove that you don't have key in there. It's just two pair of quantum particles in there.
So there are two aspects to quantum cryptography. One is the exchange of keys, which is what you're referring to, and the other is quantum computing. Let's see, who was it that gave the talk? Oh, Adi Shamir of RSA gave a talk about 2 years ago. I was going through my notes before coming here, and one of the things he predicted is for the next 15 years, this was like a year or two ago, no one will be using quantum key exchange. And I don't know it as well as Adi does, but it seems to me that there are other ways to do key exchange, and I'm not quite sure why there's all this interest in quantum key exchange. Yes.
Yeah, another
Carl?
thing you didn't mention is one of the principal reasons in the second crypto war was for the failure of the Clipper chip is there were some spectacular technical failures in the Clipper chip in the way that they tried to secure things. Their protocols were insecure, right? And because of the openness of the cryptography that you established, that it was okay to do that kind of research that was not secret, academics in the United States were able to discover these flaws, expose them, and the embarrassment sank the clipper ship.
Oh, that's something that I'd either forgotten or wasn't aware of, so thank you for adding that.
Any more questions? Zakir.
So while there's this crypto war going on based on these having strong primitives, we also have this situation where there are now more and more devices in everyone's homes. And these remain under the control of manufacturers like Apple or Amazon. And there's the potential where the government could go to the manufacturer and say, hey, I want you to take over the device in one specific home. I don't want you to weaken all of encryption. I just want you to deploy something to one device. Do you see parallels kind of between the crypto wars and this? Or are you as optimistic that it's going to play out in the same way, or where do you see that going?
The difference that I see is that in the crypto wars, there's a trade-off between giving government access when it should have access and weakening it for everybody, or creating potential holes. Whereas with Google Assistant or whatever it's called, it's what I'm saying is going back to Google to be interpreted, and so I've given up my privacy. I actually unplug mine most of the time, partly for that reason. This brings up another interesting fact, though. When the FBI and law enforcement say they want to go back to the good old days, like the 1950s, where when they got a court order, they could go and physically tap a wire and listen, what they overlook is that today they have orders of magnitude more information than they had in the 1950s. When there was a recent terrorism case, it was the guy planting bombs in Austin. And if you read about how they caught him, there was a surveillance camera in the FedEx office, which wouldn't have been there in 1950, much too expensive. And the memory to store it was cheap enough that they actually could go back however many days it was and still find it. And then they saw he was wearing pink gloves, and so they went to Home Depot where he had to buy it, and they were able to match it all up, and they got a license plate. So the thing is, for sake of argument, let's say they're getting 100 times as much data, law enforcement, as they did in the good old days, but 10% of it's encrypted. They're still getting 95 times, 10% of 100. Well, they're still getting orders of magnitude more information than they did in the good old days, but they're being stymied so frequently. And I wish I could give them that information, but I don't think it's going to hurt them as much as they say not to give them the encrypted information when they've got all these other sources.
Any more questions for Marty? Please join me in thanking Marty.